When a legend disappears, it leaves behind more than an empty space on the road. It leaves a mystery. Sometimes the answers hide under dust thick enough to write history in with your fingertip. This is Rust to Reveal, and tonight we are unlocking the tale of a Pontiac GTO that vanished not once but twice. First, it slipped quietly out of sight in the early 1990s, locked away where no one could find it. Then, decades later, it nearly vanished again, this time on paper, when its own identity was thrown into question. The stakes were hundreds of thousands in value, the car's place in history, and the pride of whoever would one day hold its keys. Stay with me, because at exactly 12 minutes and 40 seconds into this story, you will hear the twist that could have destroyed this GTO's legend forever, or cemented it for the ages. Two documents, one car, both claiming to be the truth, and yet both cannot be right. This is where our long road begins. In the early months of 1993, there was a country road barely wide enough for two passing pickups. It snaked past open fields where the winter grass shivered in the wind, and through clusters of bare trees that rattled like bones in the breeze. Halfway down this road stood a barn that looked as if it had been pulled out of another century. Its walls were patched with weathered boards so old the grain had lifted and curled at the edges. There were gaps where the daylight slipped through in thin silver stripes. The roof was a patchwork of mismatched tin sheets, each one fastened with old nails that had started to rust, giving them a reddish halo when the sun caught them just right. On this particular day, the man who had come here was not a stranger to hidden things. He was a friend of a local mechanic, and he had been told there might be something inside worth seeing. He stepped out of his truck, the gravel crunching under his boots, and for a moment just listened. The air was still, the kind of stillness you feel more than hear, only the faint sound of a distant windmill turning somewhere beyond the tree line. The barn door was swollen from years of rain and heat and cold. It resisted his first push, so he leaned in with his shoulder. The old hinges groaned in protest, and with a sudden jerk the door gave way, letting out a breath of air that smelled of dry hay, old oil, and the metallic tang of rust. It was a smell that told stories without words, stories of engines once run hard, of tools left where they last fell, of time passing without witness. Inside, the light was dim, except for a single shaft cutting down from a gap high in the wall. It landed across the front of a car sitting silent in the gloom, a Pontiac GTO, its split grille catching the beam like a spotlight hood. Scoops crouched low, badges dulled but still bearing their proud letters. The paint was buried under a skin of dust so thick you could draw a line through it with a fingertip. The man did just that, tracing a slow arc over the curve of the fender, his finger coming away grey. From the shadows, an older man stepped forward. His movements unhurried, like someone who had no reason to rush. He held a single key between finger and thumb. The old man just stopped driving it. He said the words were simple, but they carried a weight that hung in the air. It ran when it was parked, he added, as if to answer the question forming in the other man's mind. They walked around the car slowly, every step sending a faint echo into the rafters. There were cobwebs thick enough to bend when brushed by a shoulder. The tires had gone soft, sagging into themselves in the trunk. Under a brittle tarp lay a jumble of parts belts, badges, a jack, each piece a relic from another chapter of the car's life. When the talk turned to paperwork, the story shifted. The old man said the title was missing, but there was a bill of sale signed right there on a workbench. The workbench itself was a history lesson, its surface stained with decades of grease and sawdust, a scattering of old bolts lined up along one edge like forgotten soldiers. The bill of sale was written in fading ink, the handwriting leaning forward as if eager to be read. The man felt the weight of the decision in his hands. Literally and figuratively, here was a machine that once roared down highways and now sat silent in the dark, a machine that could be either a treasure or a trap. Depending on the truth of its story, he slid the bill of sale into a folder and tucked the key into his pocket. The deal was done. But even as he closed the barn door, the smell of rust and dust followed him out like a reminder that the past was never entirely asleep. As he drove away, the barn receded in the rearview mirror until it was just a small dark shape against the pale winter sky. Yet the image of that dust-covered grille stayed bright in his mind. Two documents, one car. both claiming to be the truth somewhere ahead. The road would force him to find out which was lying. A few weeks had passed since the barn door closed behind the Pontiac GTO, and its new keeper. The winter had begun to ease in small ways. The mornings were less sharp on the skin, the air softer with the smell of thawing soil and wet timber in that quiet stretch of time. The man who now held the key spent his evenings turning the bill of sale over in his hands, studying the faint pen strokes that promised ownership without the weight of a title. Somewhere in the space between excitement and unease, he knew this story had only just begun. The first sign came when he made the call to the county records office. The clerk was polite but brisk. Her words clipped like someone sifting through dozens of requests. Each hour she promised to dig out the title copy from the file room. A few days later she called back and read the number over the line. He jotted it onto a pad, but the last digit snagged in his mind. It did not match the plate riveted under the Pontiac's windshield frame. It was off by one, a tiny detail that could mean nothing or everything. He stared at the paper long after hanging up the phone. Maybe it was just a typo, a human slip of the pen, or the misread of a faded form. But maybe it was worse. Maybe it meant the car he had pulled into the light had never legally existed. If that were true, the consequences were heavy, not just the collapse of its value, but the possibility that it could never be sold or registered again. That night, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen felt louder. The lamp on his desk pooled light over the scattered fragments of evidence he had already collected. A faded insurance card from the glove box, bent at one corner. Its ink ghosting with age, a thermal print service receipt from the 1970s, with curling edges and the faint smell of oil still in the fibers, and a roster from a classic car club meeting in the 1980s. The club name printed bold at the top, 3 different documents, 2 different owners' names, but one address that kept returning like a refrain. The address belonged to a low ranch-style house with flaking white paint and a battered mailbox leaning slightly toward the road. He drove by slowly. One afternoon the curtains in the front window hung still. The yard had the quiet air of a place that had seen a lot, and spoken little tire tracks cut faintly into the gravel drive and disappeared under the shadow of a carport. The thought circled in his mind. Perhaps the car had simply been passed from one family member to another, without the paperwork ever catching up. Perhaps someone had driven it quietly without bothering to change the name on the registration. But each missing link, each break in the chain between past and present, left the truth slightly out of reach. The more he tugged on the thread, the more it seemed to wind itself into knots. He began phoning old contacts from the local garages, men with hands blackened from decades of work and voices that carried the slow weight of memory. Some recognized the address, others swore they had seen the GTO years back on the edge of town, idling outside a diner, or roaring down the straight stretch past the grain elevators. One mechanic remembered doing brake work on it in '78, said it was cherry, then all original with a sound that made heads turn. Every new piece of recollection added heat to the mystery. Each confirmation of provenance made the car more valuable, but each inconsistency made it more dangerous to believe in. The GTO had become a puzzle, where the pieces seemed to change shape every time you thought you were about to lock one into place. Late one evening, he spread the documents out across the kitchen table and traced the journey with his fingertip from the faded insurance card to the club roster to the county file note. Each name, each date, each address was like a stepping stone across water, but some stones wobbled underfoot, threatening to sink the story entirely. The night settled deep outside the windows, but inside, under the dim yellow light, the search for truth pressed on, and somewhere in the space between those papers and that key lying beside them, he began to feel the pull of a deeper road ahead, one that would not let him turn back. It was a late afternoon when the search for answers found its way back to the Pontiac's glove box. The air in the garage was heavy with the smell of dust, and cooling metal sunlight filtered through the half-open door, laying warm stripes across the hood. The man pulled the passenger door open, the hinges sighing after years of stillness, and slid into the cracked vinyl seat. His fingers moved almost unconsciously toward the small chrome button, and with a soft pop, the glove box door sagged open. What he expected to see was nothing more than a few old receipts,
But what sat on top of the pile was an insurance card so old its once white paper had faded to the shade of bone.
At first glance, it was just another scrap for the folder until his eyes found the printed engine code and his pulse ticked faster. The numbers did not match the code stamped on the Pontiac's cowl tag. If the block was not original, the car's value could fall hard in the muscle car world. Numbers matching is not just a point of pride, it is a sacred law breaking. It can turn a legend into just another machine. He leaned back, letting the card rest on his thigh, and stared at the dashboard. The grain of the vinyl, catching the weak light dust, danced in slow spirals through the beam from the garage door. Somewhere deep inside the car's frame, a sound ticked faintly as metal cooled. The need for proof began to burn sharper, and that need drove him into corners. Almost no one checks. He stripped the rear seat from its mounts, the springs creaking like old bones as he lifted it free. The air beneath smelled faintly of dry carpet padding and something else, something paper-thin and brittle. His hand closed on a folded sheet so fragile it threatened to dissolve at his touch. When he opened it, the years fell away. It was a factory-build sheet, browned with age, creased in quadrants from its long sleep. It listed every option the car had carried the day it left the line. Then came the moment that shifted the chase from strange to almost unreal. Digging through an envelope of service records, he found another build sheet, this one cleaner, as if it had been kept flat somewhere safe for decades. Most of the printed details matched the first sheet option for option line for line, but near the bottom, in a faintly different ink, a handwritten notation curled across the paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, tighter and sharper than the scrawl of assembly line notes. Holding both sheets side by side, he could feel the questions stacking in his mind. Was this a correction, a later addition, a mechanic's mark, or a clue that something had been altered long before his hands ever touched this car? The more he stared, the more it felt as though the GTO was speaking in riddles. It became clear that the mystery could no longer be solved just on paper. It would have to be read in the metal itself, in the paint hidden under panels, in the faint quirks of manufacturing that no forger could perfectly recreate. There is a kind of language in old machines, a language made of stamping fonts and rivet heads of overspray shadows and tool marks. Each tells a part of the story, and together they either prove the tale true or shatter it entirely. That night, he stood in the garage long after the sun had sunk the bare bulb overhead, throwing hard shadows over the Pontiac's curves. His hands rested flat on the fender, the cool metal under his palms grounding him in the present. Even as his mind sifted through decades of the car's past, the hunt had started with a title number. Now it was about truth in steel and ink, and he knew the next steps would take him further into that past than he had ever planned to go. The deep dive began on a morning when the air outside was crisp enough to see each breath. The garage was a cocoon of stillness, except for the faint hum of a small heater in the corner. The Pontiac sat in the center, its flanks catching thin stripes of winter light that slipped between the panels of the door. This was no longer about glancing over the surface. It was about crawling inside the history written in steel. The work started with the VIN plate itself set just below the windshield. Its rosette-style rivets showed the kind of shallow swirl pattern you get only from factory-issue fasteners. Age had coaxed a gentle halo of paint creep around each rivet that could not be faked without years of patience. He leaned in close enough to see faint dust resting in the shallow grooves. The plate was firmly seated, the metal around it, showing no signs of prying or replacement. Moving around the rear quarter panel, his hand traced the faint dent that ran just above the wheel arch. It was shallow but distinct, a kind of fingerprint in metal he carried with him, a worn photograph taken decades earlier. The grainy image showed the same dent catching the sun in almost the exact way it did now. That single imperfection was a bridge between past and present, proof that this body had not been swapped or rebuilt beyond recognition. He slipped a small light under the cowl and into the dark cavities of the frame where casual eyes never look there. The overspray was a perfect match to the exterior coat, a soft continuation of the same shade. It pooled in the hidden corners with the same uneven edge you see only when paint is applied by hand at the end of an assembly line behind the kick panel. The same tone appeared again, as though the color itself was telling him I have been here since day one. Then came the inspection of the engine block. The pad where the VIN was stamped bore faint chatter marks, the kind left by a hand-operated stamp instead of the perfectly uniform bite of a machine. The spacing between characters was slightly irregular, not the neat work of modern fakery, but something older, less calculated. He took photos from every angle and compared them to reference images from documented Pontiac restorations, and then to untouched survivors. The similarities were uncanny, yet that irregularity kept raising the question, was this a restamp or a legitimate dealer repair? The next move was to call an old contact, a retired dealership mechanic whose voice came through the lines slow and warm with memory. When told about the stamping, the man chuckled. "We used to do short block swaps under warranty," he said. "Stamp them right there in the bay with whatever tools we had on hand. Sometimes the numbers would wander a bit. Most folks never knew the difference. The words landed like a key turning in a lock. It explained the uneven marks. It explained how the block could still be correct to the car without being born under its hood. It was the kind of detail that collectors argued over late into the night, the kind of wrinkle in a story that could turn suspicion into authenticity. As the day faded and the light in the garage grew warmer, the man stepped back from the GTO and felt the shape of the puzzle shift. The car was no longer a static object, but a witness. It carried its past in paint in metal and in the faint chatter of numbers on an engine pad, all of it waiting for someone patient enough to listen.
That lead cracked the case wide open. It was a late night when the call came from a friend in the local archives. He had been digging through a stack of service department ledgers so dusty that each page sent a faint cloud into the air, and on one grease-stained notebook dated 1974, there it was in barely legible handwriting. Dealer short block installed under warranty. No flourish, no extra explanation. Just that single line carrying the weight of decades. The partial VN on the block in the GTO matched the chassis exactly, minus the slight irregularity in the stamping that had caused so much doubt in the first place.
Suddenly the shadows that had clung to the engine began to thin. This was not fraud, it was history. The engine had been changed, yes, but it had been changed in the daylight of a dealership bay by hands that knew the car from its first oil change. It was period correct, it was documented, and for a collector that meant the car had a story now, one with scars and triumphs instead of a spotless myth, and often that kind of story is worth more to the right person than perfection. But there was still one loose thread, the wrong digit on the title copy, the one that had haunted this chase from the beginning. He took the microfilm record from the county clerk and fed it into the ancient reader in the back corner of the courthouse basement. The machine hummed and whined until the image swam into focus, and there, under the official heading, was the number exactly as it should have been. No mismatch. No mystery, just a clerk's tired hand in 1993 transposing a single digit with the casual finality of a keystroke. It took only an affidavit and a supervisor sign-off to put it right, yet holding the corrected document in his hands felt almost anticlimactic after the miles of doubt they had traveled. The paper was crisp, the ink fresh and unblinking. It was official proof that the GTO was exactly what it claimed to be, and yet all the danger and possibility of the past weeks clung to it, like the smell of the barn dust that had first covered the grille. That night in the garage he sat in the driver's seat, the build sheets laid carefully on the passenger side, the warranty note beside them, and the freshly corrected title on top. The dash lights glowed faintly, casting a warm halo over the edges of the documents like an altar to the truth. The silence was thick, but it was not the silence of uncertainty anymore. It was the calm that comes when a long hunt is nearly over outside. The wind moved through the trees in slow, steady breaths, as if the world itself was exhaling after holding on for too long. And somewhere in the distance a dog barked, once short and sharp before fading into the night. With its paperwork corrected and its story sharpened, the GTO was no longer a half-forgotten ghost from a barn. It was a survivor carrying every scrape, scar and twist of fate in its steel. The auction hall where it would face its next chapter was already alive with the hum of voices, polished floors throwing back the reflections of chrome and paint under bright lights. Each car gleamed like a jewel, but the Pontiac had a presence that was heavier, older, a weight that came from the truth carved into its history. As it rolled up the ramp, the deep thrum of its engine filled the space, a sound both smooth and strong. The auctioneer's voice rose above the murmurs, calling out its name, year and provenance, the build sheets, the warranty note, the freshly amended title, all of it laid bare. There was no attempt to hide the path it had taken. Every twist of the road had been turned into a line in its biography. The room tightened with focus, bidders holding paddles poised, some on the floor, others at the phone banks where staff leaned close to pass along each new number. The first bids came quick like opening shots. Then the pace steadied, the tension stretching as each increment climbed higher under the hot glare. The paint picked up flecks of light like sparks. The air seemed to thicken with the weight of decision. Halfway through the bidding, a pause settled, so quiet you could hear the faint click of a pen in the back row. Then from the balcony, a hand lifted a phone pressed tight to one ear. The auctioneer pointed. The number jumped, the reserve cracked, and the dam broke again. Paddles went up. Voices sharpened. The screen flashed new highs until at last the hammer fell with a hard final strike that echoed off the rafters. Sold, the word carried through the space with a kind of release. People exhaled, stood shifted in their seats. The new owner stepped forward later in the quiet after the paperwork was signed. He said words that would stay with the man who had chased the truth from the first step. I would rather have the truth than a tale I cannot prove. Paper holds out in the loading area under the dim glow of sodium lamps. The transporter waited, its door yawning open. The GTO rolled forward slowly, the straps tightened over its tires, the metal buckles clicking into place as if sealing the end of a chapter. The man who had pulled it from the barn stood a little apart, watching the tail lights glow in the dark as the door closed and the rumble of the truck carried it away. The lesson hung in the cool night air. A car can vanish once in silence and again on paper, and yet with patience, with every scrap of evidence protected, with every lead chased down even through years of dust and doubt, a legend can be brought back into the light. Not just once, but twice.